Hi, good morning, everyone. We are waiting just a couple of minutes in order to more attendance to come. Hola, hi, Geoff.
Hello.
Um, don't you should be in the backstage or you are joining us already? Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Just noticing you take the camera off now.
And Paola.
It will work on here, yeah.
Okay.
We are already 16. We are just waiting a couple more of minutes to allow more people to join us. Hi, Cecilia. Good morning.
Hi, good morning, Salvador.
Hi, Paula.
Hello.
So it's 9 and 2. Would you want to wait a couple more minutes? We are almost 20 now. We have
Hi, can you see and hear me? No?
Yes, we can.
Hello? Okay, thank you. I'll have to put this somewhere.
Hi,
Sorry, I've
Geoff.
gone on an iPad instead. I've got off my computer.
Welcome.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Okay, can you hear me okay? Good.
Thank you very much.
Let's wait one more minute and we start. Okay, so it's 9 and 5. So I guess the best is going to be start now. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our panelists. We are all very excited to meet your opinions about this particular topic. And first of all, please allow me to introduce Paola, uh, who is our host today, our main host. So, Paola Maciel Garcia Meneses, is a biologist graduated from the Faculty of Science of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. She has a PhD in science from the University of Plymouth, UK. Her work has focused mainly on the study of socioecological processes at different temporal and spatial scales, from the study of processes such as pollination to global change process, mainly in Latin America systems. Within her professional career, she has held positions in the public sector as Deputy Director of Conservation of Biological Communities and Adaptation to Climate Change, as well as in organizations such as the United Nations and academia. She has published articles in international journals, technical reports, and book chapters. She is currently a researcher at the National Laboratory of Sustainability Science in the Institute of Ecology at UNAM, where she continues to work on projects in the areas of vulnerability, adaptation, and resilience to global changes, monitoring and evaluation of socio-ecological systems, as well as impact research and linking science, promoting the involvement of other key sectors for decision making. She has taught in the UK, Ecuador, and Mexico. She is a representative within the Climate Change and Sustainable Cities Working Committees of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, among others. So, Paola, the session is in your hands now. I will be back later.
Well, thank you very much, Salvador, and thank you very much, everyone. Hello and good morning, and thank you for being here. And I would like to give some words on behalf of Dr. Ana Escalante, that is our head of the National Laboratory of Sustainable Sciences of the Institute of Ecology from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, that she couldn't attend today because other issues at the direction, but she says hello and thank you very much for your attendance. So I would like to give a brief introduction of this panel and our panelists. So as it is well known that we are in a middle crisis, and sectors, countries, and communities are expecting and experiences negative effects of climate change at multiple scales. For many years, certain sectors, governments, academia have been held responsible for their actions to stop these changes. But all these actors are part of society. Socio-ecological problems have no borders and act on all scales. And to solve them, collaboration has to happen in the same way. In the last report of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, several points have been emphasized to remain within the 1.5 degrees Celsius limits. We must promote collaboration, capacity building to address the risks arising from climate change, be aware of our consumption patterns, look at successful local practices, understanding diversity of human groups, and above all, being from horizontal collaborative networks that are inclusive, built without ranks or hierarchies to solve these impacts. It is not important to talk about adaptation or migration, knowing that and mitigation, knowing that one is linked to the other, but rather to discuss the deep transformation that is needed to change integrated schemes and deconstruct previous systems to remain in this world. So the purpose of this panel is to explore the importance of collaborative climate action. We cannot talk about organized cooperation if we don't integrate people from other sectors and across different levels of government, academia, private sectors, and civil society to achieve these climate goals. So this panel wants to approach experts closely and discuss successful and not very successful experiences related to collaboration with other sectors. Which are barriers? Which are the barriers and advantages of collaboration? So we today, this morning, have amazing panelists that I would like to introduce you. So thank you very much to Dr. Ana Cecilia Conde. Dr. Cecilia is full-time researcher at the Center for Atmospheric Sciences from UNAM, Mexico. She's a specialist in impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation to climate change and climate variability, particularly in agricultural sectors in Mexico. As General Coordinator of Adaptation to Climate Change of the National Institute of Ecology and Climate Change, she was part of the Mexican delegation to negotiate the Paris Agreement. She contributed to the articles related to adaptation and loss and damage, emphasizing gender and human rights perspectives. Currently, she is a lead author of the 6th IPCC report, Group 2, Chapter 17, Decision-Making Options for Managing Risk. Thank you very much for joining us and welcome, Dr. Cecilia. Also this morning in our panel, we have Professor Geoffrey Batty. Dr. Geoffrey Batty is a professor of psychology at the Edge Hill University and has been visiting professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He was professor of the psychology at the University of Manchester from 1994 to 2012. He has obtained his PhD in psychology from the University of Cambridge and was awarded the Spearman Medal by the British Psychological Society for the published psychological research of outstanding merit and the international acclaimed Mont d'Or for his work in semiotics. He has published over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles and is the author of 26 books. His book, with Laura McGuire, The Psychology of Climate Change, which identifies psychological barriers to climate change mitigation and what is missing in the current climate change campaign, was selected by the booksellers in the conjunction with the UCL as one of the 10 essential environment reads in the Academic Book Week campaign in March 2020. Dr. Batty was also selected by the British Academy to present his research on optimism, bias, and climate change at their Summer Showcase 2018. Dr. Geoff is also a member of the International Panel on Behavior Change, which meets the UN. Thank you very much, Professor, and for joining us and welcome to this panel. Also this morning we have the PhD candidate Abril Cid Salinas. Abril Cid has a Master of Science and a specialty in Environmental and Ecological Economics and is currently a PhD candidate in Sustainability Sciences in the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Her PhD project focuses on the understanding the institutional capacities of local governments for climate change adaptation and implementation with focus in multi-level governance systems and addresses both climate risk and underlying deficiencies in human development. She also works in projects focused on capacity building and mainstreaming adaptation in the private, public, and social sector. Abril has worked in the design, facilitation, implementation, analysis, and report of projects regarding environmental impact assessment, agroecological transitions, vulnerability of urban wetlands, and coastal zones. Through her career, Abril has collaborated with multiple government levels in Mexico, international organizations, academic institutions, and non-governmental organizations. Abril is currently a project manager in Ítaca Environmental and founding member of Umbrella Transformaciones Sostenibles, an NGO focused on transformations towards sustainability. Thank you very much, Abril, for joining us this morning and welcome. Our last panelist, I would like to welcome Professor Ian Stewart. Thank you very much for being here. Professor Ian Stewart is the El Hassan bin Talal Research Chair in Sustainability at the Royal Scientific Society, Amman, Jordan, visiting professor in Environmental Studies at Ashoka University, India, and professor of Geoscience Communication at the University of Plymouth. The founding director of the University of Plymouth Sustainable Earth Institute, Ian Ian's long-standing research interests are in natural hazards, sustainable geoscience, and earth sciences communication. His geocommunication work has built on a 15 years partnership with the BBC television presenting geoscience programs, notably Earth, the Power of the Planet, Earth, the Climate Wars, How Earth Made Us, How to Grow a Planet, The Rise of Continents, and Planet Oil, and recently was academic advisor on the BBC acclaimed landmark series Seven Worlds on One Planet, awarded at the MBE from his services to geography and geology education. He is president of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society, was the communications lead of the evidence chairs for the Scottish Climate Assembly, and holds a UNESCO chair in the Geoscience and Society. Thank you very much for joining us all. As you could see, it's an amazing panel, so we are looking forward to listen to you. Before I start, I would like to explain a little bit the dynamic of this panel for the panelists and also for the attendants. So we will have around 2 hours in total, so we will have lots of time for questions, so prepare your questions. But we will have the first part dedicated to presentations for each of the panelists. We will have 40 minutes for that. The interventions are going to be moderated by Salvador. So Salvador is going to give us a sign before 10 minutes left. So, 1 minute remains. So if you hear a little voice saying, please 1 minute, just is the sign for you to finish soon. After that, we will have some trigger questions and also time for the audience to interact with you directly. We ask to the attendants, please use the Q&A button that is on one of your sides of your screen, but also we are going to be aware of the chat as well. So to start, I would like to invite Dr. Cecilia Conde. If you can, please give us your first intervention, please.
Yes, well, trying to answer the question, making emphasis in my personal experience, the importance of collaboration. I want to make emphasis on one idea, the importance of climate justice. I think climate change is a political and an ethical issue, and I'm going to give some examples of why I agree with that idea. I am from the physical science, I'm an atmospheric scientist, and I was doing a atmospheric model when I was invited to go to a meeting, working group 1 meeting in Guangzhou, China. And I was thrilled because I was going to discuss my models I thought, with some physicists that were having the same questions. So I was invited because nobody wanted to go, I have to say, because I was a master student then doing that issue. So studying the atmospheric models, including, by the way, Manabe's equations. Manabe just won yesterday, I knew, the Nobel Prize in Physics. Well, I arrived to China, and there I saw very tough discussions from, let's say, the Chinese delegate saying that China didn't emit so much methane, and also from some Arabian countries saying CO2 is not that worse from oil production. So I didn't understand what was happening, because I wanted to discuss physics, and suddenly I was in the middle of a political discussion. So yes, climate change is a political and very hard political issue. And then in the 90s, see my age, in the 90s, a project called the Country Study started. So I was asked to generate climate change scenarios for different sectors: agriculture, water, human settlements, biodiversity. And there I learned the word tailored. You have to tailor the knowledge so it could be useful for those experts. So that was an interesting experience of exchanging multidisciplinary research. It's not an easy task. You have to acknowledge that those specialists know the question. I have the same data, but there are different questions that need those data to be tailored. And then same decade, the 90s, I was invited to support the agriculture team. I didn't want to because I was a physicist, but there I met an important person in my life called Diana Lieberman, and one of her PhD students then, Karen O'Brien, and other Mexicans, agronomists and biologists that taught me that they were passionate about maize production in Mexico, not because of only the plant and the climate, but because the cultural legacy of maize production in Mexico. So we did our work, and then I was invited to a UNDP project called Capacity Building for the stage 2 of adaptation to climate change in Central America, Mexico, and Cuba. We call it the 8-country project because it's a long title for a project. And then I began to get involved with farmers, maize, rain-fed maize producers. So I learned the strong bond that Mexican farmers have with land, with their biodiversity, with the milpa, which is a multi-cultivar production of maize, and the importance of local knowledge and to manage the cultivar. That might explain the strong opposition of those farmers now to use transgenic varieties, for example. So I think climate change has also an ethical component. I have worked since then with many researchers of different scientific disciplines, and also with maize, coffee, and vegetable producers. In that last case, with women in the state of Puebla, I'm sorry. And finally, as Paola said, I accepted in 2013 to be part of the Mexican government. And I have the possibility to be a Mexican delegate for the Paris Agreement. I am proud to say that we fought and won to have gender responsive in language in the adaptation article and capacity building. And I'm sorry to say that we couldn't include human rights in that article. It's just in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. So it was a pity because we fought that to have human rights if you're going to fight climate change. And finally, I think in that being in charge of the adaptation to climate change in the Mexican government, I understand that politicians and scientists have different timing. Politicians have to have an answer in a moment, and scientists need more time, perhaps, to give that answer. So timing is a very important issue for designing policies. So I think we have to think that we need political relevant science, but also it's very important that the political decisions are taken with a well-supported scientific knowledge. So those are my general ideas, considering my experience and why I think climate justice is a key issue in the study of climate change, and it has to be multidisciplinary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cecilia. So if we can continue with experiences and the intervention of Dr. Job, please.
Okay, well, thank you. I got involved in climate change work.
Doctor, could you open your microphone? Sorry.
Oh, can
It's
you not
okay.
hear me?
Can you hear him?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay?
Okay. Yes. Sorry.
Oh, okay, sorry. I got involved in climate change research in 2006 in the UK. I'm a psychologist, and that will become clear when I explain what I do. And 2006 was an exciting year because there was a Climate Change Act put into law in the UK to reduce carbon emissions. And there was a very interesting collaborative link between business, government, celebrities, people, to try and do something about the climate change issue. And a major multinational, which is based in the UK, called Tesco, tried to lead on this by introducing carbon labeling. And the idea behind this was, the kind of philosophy was, and this was the CEO talking, to achieve a mass movement in green consumption, we must empower everyone, not just the enlightened or the affluent. So the idea was it was going to reach across classes, and all kinds of people could be involved in reducing the carbon footprint of consumption by labeling products, and for people to choose the low carbon products to drive down the manufacture of high carbon products. And Tesco were interested in working with academics from a variety of disciplines to make sure that this was on track. And of course, what was interesting about it was that all of the research, based upon people's self-reports about sustainability, seemed to suggest that carbon labeling should work really well. And this multinational had introduced the labeling of health information with fat information and calories previously, and that had an immediate effect. So they were very excited to see what happened next. So that's where I came in. Now, the first thing I did was I wanted to see whether in the time that it takes people to choose products when shopping, whether they noticed the carbon labels. So I did some early eye tracking research, presenting people with products and seeing where they looked. And the first thing that shocked me was that carbon labels, even though people expressed huge enthusiasm to say they wanted this information, they looked at the carbon labels only about 7% of the time in the first 5 seconds, which is the time normally taken, certainly in the UK, to choose a product. So they looked at it kind of minimally, which was very interesting. They looked at the more detailed carbon information about 3% of the time, and 89% of the time they looked elsewhere. So carbon labels were not kind of psychologically or emotionally salient enough for people at that time, because of course, I say emotionally salient because emotion can often drive very quick behaviors. So I thought there was something kind of important and kind of interesting about that. So even though people said they really wanted to do something about climate change, when it came to these kind of routine actions and things like visual attention, which of course are very habitual kinds of things, there was a kind of disconnect. And that kind of started kind of driving my research over the next few years. What is it about people's behavior which is so hard to change? And it just seems to me that when it comes to climate change, there are a whole series of psychological barriers which we have to be aware of, and we have to find ways of overcoming. One of those psychological barriers is people's perceived vulnerability about climate change, because human beings suffer from something which is called optimism bias. If you give them the statistics on how many marriages end in divorce and ask them about their own marriage, they always rate their own marriage as having a really good chance of succeeding, even when they know the statistics. And there's been some interesting research which shows that if you ask people to make an estimate of the probability of things going wrong in their life, and then you present them with the correct information, you only get a certain kind of brain processing of that information if the information's better than expected. If it's worse than expected, they kind of ignore it and process it less deeply. And we did some work on climate change messages. When you present people with the information and you give them the science and you give them some of the negative criticisms of the science, and you eye track them as they read that information, if they're optimists, they're more likely to focus on the critiques of the science rather than on the science and the bad news itself. So there are these kind of biases which we have to overcome. Now, when it comes to climate change, the big disconnect is what we found in that first study on eye tracking, this disconnect between what people report and what they do. It's called the value action gap. And in lots of research now, if you look at self-reports of climate change attitudes and reports of climate change and sustainable behavior, then you get a relationship between your expressed attitudes and the expressed behavior, but a very low correlation with what they actually do. And over the last number of years, what I've been trying to do is trying to access the kind of deeper level attitudes which may predict everyday habitual behaviors, which hold the key to people's actual action. Now that, of course, has become, in some sense, a more palatable idea with Daniel Kahneman's work on System 1 and System 2 thinking, because he divides up human decision making into two broad systems. One's kind of slow, conscious and controlled, and one's kind of fast, automatic and unconscious. So it kind of connects to his ways of thinking. But the idea that we've been pursuing is the notion of implicit attitudes, which are deep-seated attitudes formed by associative connections, which seem to hold the key to many spontaneous behaviors, behaviors under pressure, habitual behaviors, all the kind of behaviors that are done without much conscious reflection. Now, in other domains, people have been finding ways of measuring these implicit attitudes based on measuring associations between concepts, and we adapted that work to use in the sustainability field, and we developed a carbon IAT, which measures people's natural unconscious associations between carbon and evaluative concepts. So we've been pursuing that. And what's interesting about that work is it seems to throw up this interesting dilemma, which is these implicit attitudes don't correlate in the sustainability domain with what people report. And all of the heady days of 2006, 2007 were based upon self-reports of what people said. So what we've got is an alternative measure, which we think predicts attention to carbon labels. It predicts attention to environmental damage images. It seems to predict a carbon choice, and it seems to be a slightly more accurate measure. Now, the issue about these implicit attitudes, of course, is they develop over many years. And part of the issue, of course, with carbon and sustainability is that people have had decades and decades of advertising where high carbon lifestyles are kind of connected with success, status, identity, who you are. You could argue that the whole rise of narcissism in the last 10 years is kind of tied up with that idea. And in some sense, what the implicit measures are picking up on is picking up those natural associations. So we know people who are kind of low in their underlying implicit attitude to sustainability and low carbon lifestyles. And it throws up some interesting issues because a lot of the traditional kind of big questionnaire studies of attitudes to sustainability are going to include a lot of people who one might call surface greens, green on the surface, but their underlying deeper attitude doesn't really correlate with what they're saying. And I think that's got implications for behavior. Now, the big challenge, it seems to me, with respect to climate change and everyday human beings and everyday behavior is doing something about these implicit attitudes. Because that's the thing that the early work on the introducing of carbon label didn't really think about. Do people really emotionally connect to this? So again, over the last few years, we've been doing some work on trying to change implicit attitude. We did one experiment published in 2019, 2020, on experimentally trying to change it to see whether you can manipulate it using kind of emotional kinds of messages. And we found at least in the short term, a kind of an effect of doing that. And what we're currently doing in the UK is working in schools to say, what would the nature of climate change campaigns be like to not just produce an apparent change in behavior, reports from the children that they do think differently about the things and that they self-reports of behavior. What would it be to actually produce a change at this kind of deeper level, which we can now systematically measure? And we've been doing some work.
Forgive me, Professor. Forgive me. There is 1 minute left.
We've been doing some work in the northwest of England, working with primary school kids. We're collecting the data at the moment, but it looks incredibly promising. So our idea is really that human beings have got two systems of cognition. Some of it's unconscious. We have to work on those kind of unconscious associations. The consumer industry did it for decades. Sustainability, the green campaign needs to do something similar. We need to change people at a deeper level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Geoff. Thank you for your words. And I would like to invite a PhD candidate, Abrit Sid, for her intervention, please.
Thank you, Paola, and thank you, Geoff and Cecilia, for the exposures. They were like really interesting. From my experience, I'm talking more from a practitioner's view. I have experience in academia, but also in professional arenas, collaborating with NGOs, academia, and currently with the private sector. So right now I'm going to talk about point at one issue that I found relevant, particularly for the private sector engagement. And that could be the challenges associated to mainstreaming climate change adaptation in cross-cutting collaboration. So what does this mean when you talk about the private sector? And from my perspective, this means that we have to develop practice-oriented language and tools for these practitioners to be able to use them and to be considered and to be relevant for their needs. And something that I want to point at is that when you're navigating between academia, the public and private sector, you can see there's a lag between what it is produced in academia and what it is used eventually in the private sector. So just to make a quick example on it, I believe everybody has been reading something about transformations or adaptive transformational adaptation or so. So the thing is that you can see and you can find these conceptual and theoretical framings in the early 2000s in several academic journals. Cecilia just mentioned the work from Dr. Karen O'Brien, and you can find those in journals such as Global Environmental Change. The thing is that when you see how it was when it was explicitly addressed in the IPCC reports, you get to 2014 or so. But the thing is that this idea of adaptation and transformation have just reached the standards and that are relevant for the private sector. As an example, there are some guidelines from the ISO, International Standard Organization, on climate change adaptation. Those are the 1490 standards. So the thing is that those were published on 2019. So if you see this lag, it's like huge when you get to start talking about these issues in the language that is accessible to the private sector. And those are just guidelines. So you still have to operationalize them in the particular sector that you're working with. So my question would be like, how do you efficiently and strategically operationalize these type of guidelines in order to advance on climate change adaptation from the private sector? So the thing is that from my perspective and my experience working with the touristic sector and the road infrastructure sector, I have found that there's a huge need for investment in technical capacities, and that doesn't mean technology. Because most of the time when you talk about mitigation, it's easier for the private sector to understand mitigation. You have a basic unit, like equivalent tons of CO2 emissions, and you have approved measures and standards. And you even have like these networks of collaborations and such as science-based targets. So the thing is that with adaptation, this is a more fuzzy area, and you actually have to work more on what we call soft measures. So the thing is that there is a huge need of investment in capacity building, in accessible language and tools, and in order to trigger transformation, deep transformations within the organizational structure and operation of these businesses. So because the thing is that you can address incremental adaptations such as trying to get them to use climate services, but at the end, you want them to transform their business model. So that actually means a change of paradigm within the sector. So that was one of the things that I wanted to point out from a practitioner's perspective, that this kind of translation, but also co-production of concepts and tools is an iterative process that it takes time. It takes time to see that in a tangible way. And it also faces the challenges of greenwashing. Because when you walk into a sector that has no experience, no idea, but knows the buzzwords, you can end up calling anything adaptation. And that's a huge challenge and a huge risk for when you try to operationalize these type of guidelines and conceptual frameworks. And one thing that I wanted to change and to point out is that the reason that I'm like working with private sector, the reason why I'm co-founding with Paola this NGO that we're working on sustainable transformations is because we haven't found a specific niche within our institutions that can foster this type of transformations. So instead of waiting for these institutions to evolve, we are trying to disrupt the arena and try to build our own niche where we can foster and facilitate processes, collaborative processes, when we can explore different and innovative ways to integrate diverse types of knowledges. So I think that would be all for me. Salvador, I don't know if I was too fast, as usual.
Actually, you only used it 6 minutes and a half. I don't know if you want to use the rest of the minutes or we proceed with the rest of the panelists.
No, I think we can use the time for questions. I think it would be more valuable.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abril. Thank you very much for intervention. And the last intervention is going to be from Professor Ian Stewart. Could you have the floor?
Thanks very much, Paola. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I was born in November 1964, and right at that time, you could imagine my mum and dad had other things on their mind, but if they were looking across the Atlantic, they would have noticed that Lyndon Johnson had a landslide victory in the US presidential elections. And the reason I tell you this is because just 4 months later, but on the February the 8th, 1965, Lyndon Johnson, in his State of the Nation address, says this: "Air pollution is no longer confined to isolated places. This generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through radioactive materials," in other words, through weapons testing, "and a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels." So I was 4 months old there, and the science was already strong enough, and Dr. Cecilia has already mentioned stuff from the early climate models, but the early climate models, and indeed, 5 or 6 years of data collection from Dave Keeling at Mauna Loa on CO2 levels, was already strong enough for the President of the United States to say that burning of fossil fuels was releasing carbon dioxide and having a global effect in the atmosphere. So my question really is, why is it, I'm 57 now, my whole life the science has been at that level, why is it that we're still here? And it's always good going at the end because you can tie things together, and you've heard hints of the answers from various speakers, because the point is that since 1965, the science has been strengthened incrementally through that time. But also the politicization of climate change has increased as well, such that we get to a situation of 2015 and in Paris, where we get this actually kind of a surprise result, really, in terms of a general agreement to keep temperatures definitely below 2 degrees and hopefully below 1.5 degrees. And at that consensus, that unanimity of resolution really to do that is interesting, because the science that was in the early reports from the Charnley report, 1979, and some of these early climate change reports. The science is pretty much the same then as it was now. We've refined it, but it's pretty much the same. The basic headlines are the same. What has changed is the dynamics of the public debate. And I would argue that's not because of the scientists. The scientists have kind of kept doing what they've been doing, but it's been picked up by different actors. It's been picked up by the politicians, clearly, and most of the key proponents of the Paris Climate Agreements were political kind of leaders. But it's also been picked up by theologians and faith groups, the Pope's encyclical, for example, but other faith groups talking about the religious, spiritual aspects of climate change and the role of planetary stewardship. It's been picked up by CEOs, major people like Elon Musk, that's actually talking about opportunities of climate change, and also people like Paul Polman of Unilever talking about the bottom line effect on businesses if they ignore it. And of course, it's been picked up by Hollywood stars called Leonardo DiCaprio and the like. And so really what's happening is all those people have been giving different facets, different perspectives onto something that started off as a scientific issue and then quickly spilled out beyond that. So when we look at it today, in terms of who is it that's talking about climate change, we find that actually the scientists are quite a quiet, muted voice amongst all of this. Most of the people who are speaking about climate change root it into the scientific messages. They talk about that the science is extremely important, but it's not really scientists that have the dominant voice. It's local communities. It's people on the front line that are talking about the changes in livelihood. So Inuit hunters up in Greenland talking about the advance of the melting of the sea ice that's completely changed their hunting and practices and livelihoods. It's movements on the street. Really started, I guess, by Greta and the Fridays, Striking for Fridays, but who's galvanized a young youth movement that's completely re-energized the whole climate communication debate. It's groups like social movements like Extinction Rebellion that have been, and we've got this Insulate Britain now in the UK that's even more radical, that's really taken to the streets and taken it into people's faces. And then it's broadcasters, but people like David Attenborough, that's really trusted people on our screens that for decades suddenly talking about the importance and urgency of climate change. So we end up with people like Christian Fierras, who's the architect of or one of the main architects of the 2015 climate agreement, saying, we are entering the most critical decade of human existence. By the end of the 20s, we will have largely decided the quality of life on this planet for centuries to come. There has never been a more urgent time for the superpower of media companies. The time to use it is now. And Attenborough himself has this quote saying, "Saving the planet is now a communications challenge. We know what to do. We just need the will." So the question I have in my head really as a scientist is, what is the role of the scientist at the moment, the environmental scientist, the climate scientist? What is the role of them amongst this set of communicators trying to talk about the importance? And so I think that one of the things we're going to have to do is change the dynamics of science communication. So I think of science communication basically in three modes, really. The first mode is what I refer to as make and sell. And make and sell is essentially where the science, it's in the universities, it's thought of by the scientists. We're interested in pursuing knowledge, and we find that knowledge, and then we want to tell people about it. We want to sell it out the door like a product. So the public haven't asked for this product. We've used their money to get it, and we're telling them how amazing we are and how amazing our science is. So that's about being a better communicator. It's about using media and journalistic practices. But actually, that's a very one-way process, and it's just kind of transmitting science to the public. And we know that that's actually not a very effective way to change people. And the second area was referred to as sense and respond. And this is Jeff's area. This is the science of communication. It's understanding that there's ways of thinking, ways of processing data. Jeff mentioned Daniel Kahneman's fast and slow thinking. It's about framing. It's about mental models, about trying to get into the head of people, understand how they work. But then essentially using that knowledge, that intelligence to frame your messaging, target your messaging, to persuade them to drive behavioral change. And for a lot of scientists, that's seems quite dodgy. But actually, where we are at the moment, behavioral change is an absolutely critical part of all the dimensions of climate change. But as Cecilia mentioned at the start, I think there's an area beyond that, really, which is what I call guide and co-create, which is having a sense of leadership and direction from the so-called experts about where this is going. So that's where climate scientists can be saying, look, we've got this intelligence from models and from data and things like that. We think we know it's going this way. However, the key element here is working with people, with the stakeholders, with communities, with politicians, whatever it is, to co-create the journey through. And that's a tough area where scientists and engineers and all the rest of it haven't really wanted to tread. And the point that I would make, and it comes back, I think, harks back to both Jeff's point and, well, actually all three people's point, is that the skill sets for those three domains are completely different. So the skill set for making cell is understanding the media, knowing how it works, social media, broadcast media, understanding the importance of narrative and things like that, being a better storyteller or imagery. But the sense and respond skill set is about interdisciplinary thinking with particularly the social sciences around understanding how, as I said, people process information, audience segmentation, a much more empirical science-based approach to this. And a recognition that we're in the persuasion game in that sector. And then that last one, guide and co-create, well, that's very transdisciplinary. It's genuinely participatory. It's about bringing different people into the process of science. It's reflexive. It's deeply ethical. Huge ethical questions about what our role is, etc. And I think that if scientists are to really contribute meaningfully to the debate as we go on, we've got to start being more effective communicators. And by that, I mean getting past the idea of simply selling our science out there to actually starting to, how do we make connections with people, build relationships with people? And I think, as someone who's a physical scientist, that is difficult because that is not what we're trained to do. It feels sometimes deeply uncomfortable to be actually a catalyst or an activist driving change. And so ethically, a lot of scientists would draw the line there. But these are the kind of questions that I think we're going to have inside of science in order to be useful to society. And I think I'll stop it there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention. And yeah, I think from all the panelists that have a different experiences around their careers, and all these successes and barriers have been expressed. And there is lots of questions in the chat and also in the Q&A. So I think we can jump to them just to start and trigger more discussion. I'm sure that many points were raised, and there are more things that we can talk about. So I think Salvador can help us with the questions, please. Could you?
Yeah, sure. And okay, I have written the questions in order. So the first one is from David Kruppel, and it is for Cecilia Conde. The question is, how far do you think a great awareness of climate justice can help to reduce the emission of GHGs?
Yes, I think climate justice focus or enhance the idea that climate change is not a physical problem or even just or mainly an environmental problem. It's a problem of people. So you start thinking, where are the inequalities? Why are we having this problem of climate change? And I have discussed that perhaps we could make analogies with the pandemic we are living, and we have lived for almost 2 years, because we have problems. It's not only a problem of health, it's not only a problem of economy, it's a problem also of inequalities. And there are several studies that show that in in the previous pandemias, other SARS, H1N1, and so forth, rich people might get richer, and poor people are getting more and more poor. So inequalities, the gap between the rich ones, the 1% richer, it's getting, can recover faster than the poorest people. There's a UNEP recent it's called the gap, emission gap or something, that in 2021 or 2022 is a publication that shows the 1% more rich people in the world emit like 70 times more than the poorest people. So yes, I think we have to discuss justice. In the case of climate change, we have to discuss justice if we want to reduce this emission gap that the UNEP mentioned. So I think young people, as Jan said, are very aware of that. Indigenous people, and some women organizations are aware of the inequalities that trigger this increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So I think it's important to say there's a problem of inequity in the world, so let's fight it if we want to reduce climate change, if we want to face this pandemic and perhaps the next one. No? That's my point of view. Mm-hmm.
Diane?
Yes, yeah.
Can I add something to that? Because I had, I think, mentioned in the introduction that I was the evidence lead for Scottish Climate Assembly, and I should explain what the Climate Assembly is first, because a Citizens Assembly is. So it was basically 100 ordinary people demographically selected to be representative of age and every aspect, including their actually attitude to climate change. So people who thought it was a load of rubbish and people who were actually activists, but most people in the messy middle not understanding and not really having much interest in it. So this 100 people over the course of six months during the COVID, we took them through the question they had to answer was, how can Scotland change to meet the Paris Climate Agreement in a fair and effective way? And this is what I'm getting to. So the very first week that we had, or the very first session, we had to explain climate science. We did that relatively fast. But actually, one of the things we had to spend a lot of time over was fairness. What do we mean by fair? What is just? And that's had a Scottish context to it and had a global context to it. And actually what we found, and then as the process went through, more and more time was allocated to them so that in the end they were driving the whole process. But the question of fairness and justice did not go away. It was always, the solutions were always framed from their side with around whether it was fair, particularly in somewhere like Scotland, where we have a fossil fuel industry that's very important and we're moving away from it, making sure that was important. So my sense there is from that Scottish experience was that ordinary people are very aware of the sense of fairness. And I think there's been some, Jeff will have a better idea, but I think there's been some work done in the psychology field by, I think, Louise Whitmarsh and the Cardiff group, and fairness is one of the issues that seems to bring all sides of the political agenda together. The sense of something being unfair actually is something that unites people. So I think there's social justice is a critical part. Is by kind of keep it there, and I'll shut up.
Thank you very much. And I don't know if Avril or Jeff have a reaction of this question, or shall we pass to the next one?
No, I thought both speakers have made some very interesting points on kind of justice and fairness. It's interesting, really, because I suppose I think that connects to a number of other kind of core psychological dimensions about because part of it's about what potentials people have for change. Part of it's about expectations about other people's, kind of reading other people's situation. But I suppose I always come back to this notion that I always in my work, I'm trying to differentiate arguments that people use as opposed to the kind of drivers of their own behavior. And I think sometimes there's a discrepancy. And sometimes people will use concepts of fairness to explain why they haven't engaged in some actions. I don't know if this is going to be a very unpopular point. Engaged in some actions. The reasons they've engaged or not engaged are down to kind of deeper level processes. But then fairness is often a kind of argument that they will use for why change did or did not occur. And I think over the last few years, I've done a lot of work on that kind of subtle relationship between kind of argumentation and the drivers of behavior. And I think to me, that's a kind of an important point, because in the end, we want people to change their behavior. We wanted them to do things differently. And I suppose what I'm always trying to do is to access those things which influence that. So I personally, I think, of course, justice and fairness are extraordinarily important, and should be core to our decision making. But what I'm always reminded of is that sometimes there are much more deeper level and selfish drivers of behavior, and then there is a whole other layer of discourse and narrative and explanation which we then have to look at. So I kind of resonate with all the points that have been made, but I don't want to just be on the panel as a cynical psychologist, but I think there is other things to think about as well, as what I'm saying.
I just would like to add something.
Yes, Avril, sorry. Go ahead.
I was gonna point at the role of the scales. When you talk about climate justice, sometimes seems like really open and adding not attached to a particular dimension. And something that it is key is like what it is when you look at it at a community scale, and how would it look like at a sectoral scale, and even talking about multinational or international organizations. And I think it needs to be addressed through those different scales, and particularly thinking about the transportation sector and its role without being attached to a particular country, and talking about how can communities at ground level can work and most of the time adapt instead of work, or maybe working on carbon sinks. And that was it.
Sorry, Stuart. Yes.
Yeah, no, it was just something Jeff said that it's very much a UK thing at the moment, but it's very interesting that we have this very radical streets movement called Insulate Britain, and a lot of the narratives on both sides is around fairness. So their narratives are around social justice globally and the importance of this. But if you look at the comments as to people that have been disrupted by this streets movement, it's around, it's not fair. They're stopping us doing what we're supposed to be doing. I'm supposed to be getting to the hospital. They're stopping me. It's not fair. So I think that sense of fairness it's a good point, is that people use it as a tool in the occasion they're there. And so what we mean by, and I think that's maybe that point is that it speaks to the point that the idea of what is fair, what do we mean by fair, and what do we mean by justice needs to be a central part of the conversation to sort that out before we actually can move ahead, because otherwise people use it for different ends.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, Ian, by the way, a really good point. I'm reminded that some of the work we have done is we look at people's anticipation of whether they would or would not do stuff. And what's really interesting is, sometimes we try to play them bits of different films or different articles or something, which reminds them about other countries and what their current responsibilities and actions are. And what's really interesting, I mean, again, it's a very odd model of human beings, but this notion that they are like, I'll just use the cliche, cherry pickers. They will find things that they think, oh, that's great. All unconsciously, of course, I'll put that in my repertoire. And what you find is that it will either inhibit or disinhibit certain actions they will then do, depending upon what information they've just been fed. And all the work we've been doing on kind of optimism, bias, and processing messages suggests that people are and again, I'm really interested in this aspect of it's selective attention, but it's not driven by conscious processes. There's anticipatory attention in which they know what's coming up, and then they will attend or not attend. So human beings, it seems to me, have got this great capacity to all, and you're right about insulin Britain and the lorry drivers. They both feel they're right, and they're both selectively attending to aspects of the information environment, including issues to do with injustice.
Cecilia.
Yes, I have this experience with my students. This semester, I told them the most important results of the working group 1, and they were really scared. And yesterday I discussed with the scientific disseminations of our university disseminators, and they say it's scary, it's whatever. So we need alternatives. And I think I haven't thought a lot of this climate anxiety or depression that our students are living. And I think it's a very important issue. But I think we have to discuss that it's not an individual and a government. I think students need to see themselves as a group, a part of a community, and try to push responses as groups, as a social network that says, let's fight for this. And in a community, the sense of justice, it's constructed in a community, like indigenous knowledge, indigenous peoples or local communities. They have a common sense of what is fair and what is unfair. Because I agree, you could use the argument of justice or unfairness to do business as usual, as the selfish position that you just discussed. But I think young people have to recognize they're part of a group, part of a community, and start discussing what is fair. In the case of gender, we are trying to push a cross-cutting box that's called gender, climate justice, and transformative pathways. Because yes, we want justice, but we also want to change a transformative future, a different future, I would say.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And we have more questions, yes.
Perfect. And precisely talking about justice, we have another question that is very related. Does justice and fairness extend to non-human species? Who wants to start?
I'll start to get it rolling. I mean, I think that there's a very obvious reason for why it does, and that is because the biosphere is this interconnected element, and so much of what when we're talking about climate change, but often it's intimately interrelated with biosphere change, habitat loss, and all of the other aspects. And so I think that in terms of having a sense of planetary stewardship, then that has to be a big part of it. And I think a lot of the organizations that are certainly pushing on climate change are also pushing on aspects to do with pushing against biodiversity loss. So the companies that are starting to emerge around more purpose-led organizations, their big social kind of ethical dimensions are around actually not to do with people, it's to do with habitats, environments, and species. Then I think there's a whole different side, which is around the ecocide argument, which is whether, the International Court of Human Rights, for example, should have legislation, as was originally planned when it was put forward, for ecocide, as so environmental crimes against the planet. which also brings in things like kind of species loss. So I think from a scientific point of view, it has to be because it's connected into that whole Earth systems kind of approach, but also from a moral and ethical point of view, it's the touch point for many people's way into climate change.
Yeah. Again, I think there's some very good points there. I mean, there's the whole biodiversity argument, but I think there's also the argument about if we treat animals and other species in particular ways, what we do is we learn a mechanism for justifying our behavior in doing so. So last year and a half ago, I did a book on trophy hunting, and part of my interest there was really trying to understand how people could do it in the first place. I mean, how can you kill beautiful animals to make yourself feel better? What's going on psychologically? So part of my research was really kind of deconstructing the kind of blogs and posts that people who do that kind of thing do to justify why it's acceptable. And you know, in some sense, I found the whole journey extraordinary, really, because you see that there's a set of repertoires that people draw upon to build a narrative where they construct themselves as being incredibly at risk when doing some of this stuff, in which there is zero risk at all. The only risk is financial risk because it's so expensive. But again, I suppose I'm interested in that notion of you know, in this case, the masks that people can wear, built through language, built through constructive repertoires, to justify their actions. And it seems to me that, and of course, surprise, surprise, there are certain personality correlates of this kind of thing. Certain people are drawn to it. And again, it's the same old personality correlates, which is such an issue for society generally, which is narcissism and degrees of psychopathy, you know, which, you know, non-clinical psychopathy, which kind of predict, which kind of correlate with the repertoire. So it just seems to me that some mistreatment of animals clearly is a testing ground for why you can be inhuman and unfair to any species, including your fellow human beings. And I think that it kind of is a way of reinforcing a kind of way of constructing and dealing with the world. And I think for that reason, I think it does apply to non-human species.
I just would like to add more from a more pragmatic perspective to that. I think we all agree that yes, it should be extended to non-human species. But what exactly does that mean in practice? When you talk about this business on hunting wildlife, what does that mean? What are the implications for these parks? For example, in Africa, or we have these figures in Mexico as well. Like you get to hunt one animal, you get enough income for the park, so you can maintain protection because nobody, not even sometimes the state, is not addressing the needs of those parks. So my question would be like, I think we all agree, but how does this look like in practice? And we can talk about wildlife, but we can also talk about meat production. I think that's a key example on how this look like, not only for biodiversity, for land use change, but also for the emission of greenhouse emissions. So the thing is that, what are the potential pathways that we have to explore, and sometimes even at the expense of challenging business models in economic sectors, in order to get to that in practice? So I just leave that because I think it's a really large conversation. But yeah.
Sorry.
Go
Yeah, no, it's a very important point, which is how do you go from that to the kind of pragmatic realization of it? At one level, I think the kind of practical answer is, if the first thing you do is you contest their narratives. Cecilia talked about communities are the place to build concepts of social justice and fairness. Well, the point about people who hunt wild animals is they have their own communities where these narratives are allowed to flourish and develop. So they have a very specific culture. So my practical thing was to say, look, let's look more closely at the arguments you're using here and show that this kind of fallacious reasoning in it to make, to impact on the culture itself. I mean, and obviously part of the implication of the work I did was that certain governments, including the South African government, are now looking upon what they might do in terms of the legal system of doing something about it. Because I think once you study these things quite closely, you see patterns in the whole thing, and you see where all the weird psychological biases start slipping in. So I think there are practical implications, and I think the question about what's the limits of this, does that also apply to other types of practices involving animals, etc. I mean, again, I think it's a good and important question.
Can I make a comment? Or you want to move on? Eh?
If you want
I think you're losing your, or I am losing you. But I'll say something very quickly. I think, well, we have two problems. One is that, for example, people don't relate the pandemic with the loss of biodiversity. That's a great challenge to explain to people, and it's global. The second thing is, yes, we have the Convention of Climate Change, the Convention of Biodiversity, the Convention of to combat desertification, and perhaps they have different budgets or whatever, and there are different communities of researchers. But at a local level and a community level, people live the three realities. If you go and talk about climate, they will talk about biodiversity, agriculture, land, loss of fertility, soil fertility, and so on. So I think the problem is we usually think as different parts of the reality that are integrated in the real-time world of everybody. So it's important that the community of or the convention or the community that study biodiversity get linked to the community that study climate change and the community that is analyzing the loss of fertile soils or soils in general. So I just want to leave it there because, well, there's 3 points that Rockstrom in the planetary boundaries pointed out, and I think it's important that in our research we are conscious of those limits. We study that way. We study just atmospheric physics, and then we met somebody that study biodiversity and somebody that's expert in soils. But you realize that the reality of small communities or farmer communities leave the three things and the political problems and the social problems and so that's my comment.
We can't hear you well, but if you agree, Paola, while you try to repair your microphone, we will proceed with the next question. And okay, the next question is for Dr. Aubry, and is, what do you consider to be the most effective ways of helping people, ordinary people, to be better at detecting greenwash?
Thank you, Salvador. I'm not a doctor
Almost.
yet, but almost. Yeah, someday. The thing is that I've read this question and I've been working with different communities on practice, and sometimes it's like I know the private sector is usually the source of many of degradation processes, of many of the demand of raw materials that entail biodiversity loss. But the thing is that most of the times it's difficult. It kind of looks like a black box. And I think the first thing is that if you want to understand what's the greenwashing in a particular sector, you have to start like trying to understand it, at least in a simple way, but try to understand how it operates and how it works. And something that I've been discussing with my colleagues recently is that there are several benchmarks that several sectors have to observe, not only because sometimes they want to use it for reputation, but also because some financial organizations are starting to impose them to them. So some of the examples are all the ESGs, environmental, social, and governance benchmarks and standards, and the performance standards, for example, from the IFC, International Finance Corporation, and also the standards that the World Bank is already including in its operation. I'm not saying those are the solution. I think there's a long road before you get to see these benchmarks in a paper and you get to see the reports. But I think it's important to try to understand the role of these benchmarks because they do make a difference between talking about organic, socially just trade, and stuff like that. And you can actually see like what does that mean to get that label. And the top of those one of the top of those processes is the use of certifications like the ISO that I mentioned. Now, that process from getting your label as ecologically something to getting a certification from an ISO, it's a huge gap. You, as an organization, you have to invest not only in getting an external to give you audit, but also to invest in your own staff and in your own and modify your own processes in order to get certified by that. And that certification conveniently expires. So they need to get like this continual certification and after some period. The thing is that for ordinary people, I know it's a challenge, but you have to stop addressing this as black boxes, and maybe the sector of your interest, you can start to get informed on how it operates, on the reports that it provides to the corresponding authorities, not only national authorities, because most of the time national authorities have different heterogeneity in their capacities, but you can perhaps start looking at the international organizations responsible for these certifications. It's not enough from my perspective, but it is something that you can start with. And I don't know if the rest of the panel would like to, from their own practice communities. Jan?
Well, I was just going to endorse what you're saying about things like that regulatory environment of ISOs around sustainability, and that environment, that business environment, is getting much more tightly regulated, particularly from the financial side, and it's actually getting, it's not necessarily something that ordinary people will see from the outside, but internally, you can really tell the difference between a company that's doing something and a company that's not. The thing that I was going to raise really was just a word of caution for people around, understanding where companies are and how they change. I think that, many companies are in a difficult position about how they move and how fast they move. One of the reasons is that most companies are required to produce a profit for shareholders, for example, and are incumbent on their shareholders buying into that vision. And there's been examples just in the last year of CEOs of major companies who made a big effort to go green and environmental, and the shareholders throwing them out. And so I think that the pace of change will pick up. It might not be fast enough, but I think sometimes companies get criticized because what they're doing is seen as greenwash, and actually what they're doing is they're starting to try to turn that juggernaut around and starting to bring things in, and they know it's not enough, and they're getting told internally and externally it's not enough. And I think that collectively, and this is across the board, whether it's business and politics or academia or anywhere, I think we have to be much more supportive about people on the direction of travel they're on, rather than where they actually are, and see it as a continuum rather than a binary, you know, that someone's either green or not green. But yeah, that's a really difficult question, for especially for that perspective of the question about ordinary people, how they would see that.
I just would like to add something to that, Ian. And this is something that I encounter. The organizations that I work with can have a huge potential because they do have processes that are way more efficient than in other sectors. So that's an opportunity. That the pace of change can be faster. And like if you steer that change in a more inclusive, just and sustainable direction, then you can see actual outcomes in more shorter periods. But the thing is that it's up. You in the process you have to address the trade-offs. And as you pointed, these are businesses that have to produce, and they have to have incentives. And on one side, you have the financial institutions starting to impose this, like, or not impose, maybe that's not the word, but invite them to observe these standards. And eventually, these standards will be obligatory for them to access to particularly funds. And this has been raised particularly in green recovery strategies after green recovery after COVID. And I think it's worth to look at the guidelines that these institutions have been starting to push since 2020. That's one thing. And the other is that they it needs to be addressed from the business model perspective, like what incentives and what regulations can be put in place in order to foster those type of changes. And those things are not isolated to the organizations or to the businesses. Those things can also be enforced or by authorities, or can be promoted by the social sector. So it's more an idea of like not how we only oversight this organization, but how we collaborate and how we participate in these processes.
Yeah. I mean, my experience of this is quite limited, really. But I suppose what my experience has taught me is the accusation of greenwashing is a really serious one for the organization itself. So the companies I was connected with was Tesco and Unilever. I've done some work for Unilever. And as I said, in 2006, 2007, Tesco introduced carbon labeling. No, it was interesting because they all of the labels were validated by the Carbon Trust. You know, they were very expensive to do. The plan was that they were going to label all of their 70,000 own brand products. And they started with a number which took a long time to do, to work out the whole kind of life cycle assessment of them. And even though they were doing that, it was because Tesco had a reputation for building these massive stores outside towns, and with all the carbon implications of that, it was accused as a kind of greenwashing strategy by Tesco, even though they were, my understanding was, you know, from what I saw, very, very committed to it. And of course, that strategy, that was one aspect which had an unfortunate effect. The other was that they assumed that other businesses would join them in doing this, and it didn't happen. And of course, the third was, when I was talking about the eye tracking stuff, is that people weren't really noticing the labels, they didn't understand them, and they didn't buy the low carbon products. So at every level, it failed. Now, how important greenwashing was to their final decision to discontinue it, because they stopped it in 2012, remains to be seen. But I'm sure the accusations were quite important for them. So, I mean, it's in some sense, given the agreed consensus about the importance of climate change, you know, agreed meaning let's forget about the deeper level for a second. To me, it's not, you know, it's obvious why people would want to greenwash, but I suppose the only point I'm making is that once you make the accusation of greenwashing, it has implications and not necessarily positive implications, because obviously they then just give up on carbon labeling, which is a shame. So it kind of feeds into a whole series of factors which drive the future trajectory of the business, I think, with respect to sustainability.
Can I throw in another thought there, which is that we're very quick to talk to business and use business and greenwashing, but the sector that I would have the most accusation for is the university sector, because I think that the university sector is completely greenwashed. It's a sector that sees itself mainly through its research as being critical to everything, and researchers with scientists that's found something. But most universities I know haven't changed at all in the way they do their business. Their infrastructure, their architecture are exactly the same. They work on business models that are encouraging. They want foreign students to come, etc. Their staff, the people that fly most, it's professionals. And if you look at the professionals, it's academics. And if you look at academics, it's climate scientists fly more than anyone else. So until we're actually relevant to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, in terms of what we do, how much is greenwashing, how much is fundamental root and branch change in the organisation to address a climate emergency, I don't think we should be shouting at other people about it as well. So,
just a very quick comment. Considering Abril's comment, the coffee producers in the state of Veracruz struggle to have certificates so they could, of course, sell organic coffee, and that's was quite a struggle. And they, at the end, they say, who certificates the certificated people, because they start asking for things coffee producers decided not to achieve or try to get. And also they have the discussion of, if we follow the rules of the certificate company, they are deciding over our territory. So there's this idea of they losing their independence or they control over the territory. So there are different levels, but I think it's very important. I haven't studied the industries, I confess to Abril now, but it's very important. I have one student that works for the Exxon company, and she asked a lot of questions that I don't have the answers. So I will ask you for help, Abril.
Well, sorry.
I just want
Well, okay, but please be quick, because we have 5. Can you hear me? No.
So, yeah, I can. Okay, just fast. These things, certifications, work when you have like standardized processes and services. That's completely like a challenge when you work with livelihoods that would not comply with those services and processes. So there's a huge gap to work with, and to actually ask, like, what's the certification worth in this context? And maybe this they're more talking about these labels, market labels, that can actually be more recognized by the consumers, instead of having this other organization or state trying to certify all these processes that will be heterogeneous, that will not comply exactly with the processes that they are pointed at. And most of the things, these things are usually like context independent. So there's a huge challenge when you try to get into something that is contextually relevant. So that's why I said, like, this should be taken, but these are not enough, and these have their own challenges. That was it. But yeah.
Thank you very much. And well, the conversation is amazing, and we have 5 questions more. So they are tagged for specific people. So Salvador can let us know the next one and who is the chosen one.
Okay, perfect. And the chosen one, our next chosen one is Dr. Geoffrey. Please, doctor, what can be a better type of advertisement to encourage more sustainable behaviors in the citizens? This one is from a sustainability student.
It's a very interesting question. Recently I've done a review of climate change campaigns and the kind of messages that they send out. I think if I had to make a very simple point, I think the first point I'd make is that there's been too much emphasis on fear and guilt in climate change messaging. And I think fear, from a psychology point of view, kind of does work, but it only does work if people have got high self-efficacy and high response efficacy. In other words, if they think they can do something and they think they know what to do, which will make a difference. If they aren't both high, then people just find other ways of coping with strong fear in a message. They deny it will affect them. They think I'm just trying to be manipulative, that's reactance, or they just avoid the message altogether. So fear kind of works, but only under very, very special circumstances. But given the work I've been doing on eye tracking and the way people jump across messages, I keep thinking what climate change messages have to do is to have the ray of hope to say, look, if you do certain things, then there's all kinds of positives. So Cecilia's point about community, which is, look, there are certain types of transport which will allow you to bond and see your neighbours. It'll be healthier to walk on certain journeys. There's all kinds of positive things, and kind of building up the kind of reputational value of what it is to be, concerned about these issues, to get away from this whole notion of conspicuous consumption of the consumer state. We have to do something. So I think the messages have to be more positive. I think fear can be used, but in not necessarily in moderation, but only when it's quite clear what people can do to deal with it. So fear on anti-tobacco adverts worked pretty well because it was obvious what you had to do in order not to have what it showed you on the cover, i.e. stop smoking. When it comes to climate change, sometimes people find it a bit more difficult to think about what they should specifically be doing. And I think that's the obvious answer. But I mean, to me, it's a massive question. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect of the whole thing is, I think we need to change these underlying implicit attitudes. That they're the best predictor of habitual behaviors. And we need a campaign. The only way I can put it in, and I'm sorry if this sounds horrific, make sustainability sexy. It has to be sexy. It has to be emotional. You think, wow, I want some of that. And that's what they did with consumption, and that's what they did with selling tobacco. And it's hitting those kind of deep level networks that human beings have. And if you can do that, you've got it cracked.
Thank you very much for your answer. And I think we can go to the next question. And if we have some minutes left, we can carry on with an open discussion. Is that all right?
Yes.
Great.
Paula, I have a confession. My iPad has got 4% power left.
If you want to go and charge it.
So after 4%, I'll be disappearing into the ether. Okay.
Okay. No worries. Let's see if it lasts longer. Okay, Salvador, please.
Okay, actually, our next question is open for the panel, so I will read it, and one of you can raise your hand or something. What is your main expectation on the upcoming COP26?
I'll start on that because it's in my hometown and I'm going to be there, and I'm actually hosting the Presidency Day 8 on a part of it on climate adaptation. So I'm actually spending quite a lot of my time thinking of COP26. Having said that, I think there's a lot of clearly there's a lot of attention on COP26. I think it is extremely important. And I think there's a whole set of things that have come together over the last few months, both negative things with floods and fires, positive things like Biden, that have given it greater impetus. But it is just one staging post on a long road. And I think that we mustn't put too much emphasis on COP26 being make or break, because otherwise we'll have a Copenhagen situation, which is when there was a great expectation at Copenhagen. It didn't happen, and everyone said, oh, it's a disaster, and then we had Paris, and that was great. So I think that we have to see it as part of a process, but almost certainly this is a really acute time to be pushing some of these agendas, and I hope it will be really good. I hope it'll be very positive, but as I say, I think we shouldn't put too much pressure on it.
Thank you very much, Cecilia.
Yes, I think one claim that was announced by several civil organizations is because of COVID, they cannot travel to COP in Glasgow. So that's important because, but I know young people organizing what's called MOCK, M-O-C-K, which is interesting name. They're gonna fight for climate justice. It's the first point on their agenda. And I also think the expectations would be decided because of the Biden and China's pre-agreement on what are they going to reduce. So that's almost settled, I think. I'm not sure. But Joe Biden wants to make something to show the difference between Trump and Joe Biden in COP26. And I think the problem of the money that has to be delivered by the COP that must have happened in 2020 and didn't happen. So developing countries want to go and see, is the money is going to be delivered for developing countries to reduce emissions and adaptation. So those are some of the expectations I think are expected in the UK. I'm sorry, not the UK, in Glasgow. sorry.
No, it is the UK COP, so it's
okay.
fine. It's not
Okay. Okay.
Thank you very much for the question. And how many do we have, Salvador? Just to write them both. I think there are two more, right?
We have two more questions, yeah.
Could you make them together, because we are almost on the time, so we can just leave them there and have a short closing for this very active table.
Yeah, sure. Okay, the first one is, do you see any relationship between climate justice issues and the rise of denial of climate science? And the second one, or do you want to answer briefly this? Any of you?
I didn't understand. The rise of what?
Oh, the rise of denial of climate science. Rise of
Denial.
denial.
Okay.
Sorry, yeah. Denial. And do I read the next one, or someone wants to answer briefly?
Can I just make a point on that? Because I think I would argue it hasn't, because I think denial of climate science, skepticism of climate science really has been in a big way with us since the 1980s, early 1980s, when we started looking at this as also through an economic and political lens. And I don't think we were, it might have heightened it with discussions around climate justice, but I think denial has always been there it's the way that vested interests push against it, and using the operations of the tobacco industry and the big pharma in climate change. So I think it's part and parcel of modern science, if you like, these days.
Mm-hmm. I also think that it's a challenge for scientists between the scientific information and the fake news. And I think the fake news are winning because exactly we give the message things will get worse, which they're going to be worse because of the processes and trends of climate change. And we don't have the expertise to disseminate and to give alternatives, lines of action for young people, for different sectors. And I think denials of climate change also could also be, I think we should look at the data, but I think denials of climate change are also the denials of the virus and the pandemic, and I'm not getting sick, and if drink a cup of chlorum, I will get cured and whatever. But they're similar people, and they're similar structural discourses. So, and we are losing. We can not reach a lot of people as social media and the fake news are reaching. So we have to discuss a strategy. We need something to tell people things are getting worse. There are alternatives, and so on. So because denials, I think they control a lot of media. I think.
Yeah. Climate change denials tied up with people's misunderstanding of what science is and how it progresses and how you summarize scientific statements, really. I think people have been confused by, the probabilistic statements in the various IPCC reports over the years. The idea that it's not certain, that it's just extremely likely or likely. I think ordinary people might not get that. And I think the point about fake news is it gives you a particular narrative, a way of understanding the world, which is very handy if you can subscribe to it, because you can explain so much with so little. Whereas science is more difficult, and I made the point earlier about private companies versus scientific institutions, the rate they work at, and the rate they make their conclusions more sounder. And I think the public get a little bit kind of confused about that. So I agree with Ian that denial's been about for a long time. I think it's quite clear that just like tobacco, the whole thing was orchestrated to a certain extent. I mean, I find that whole business of the setting of whatever it was called, the Tobacco Research Centre, in 1953, to combat, when it was quite clear that smoking was connected to lung cancer, to set up that famous scientific debate about it, and then paying these great experts like Hans Selye and the stress expert and Hans Eysenck, the personality psychologist, to say, there's a correlation between smoking and lung cancer, but it's not smoking gives you cancer. Certain people smoke and they suffer from stress, and it's stress that gives you cancer. Or in Hans Eysenck's case, it's certain personalities who smoke, and those personalities are prone to lung cancer. So this notion of setting up spurious debates around it and allowing people to pick sides and having balanced arguments on the BBC and other media institutions was just the wrong policy. So it doesn't surprise me that people have ended up going to fake theories, fake news to give them a worldview, because everything else is just more difficult and apparently contested.
Thank you very much. And we are going to trigger the last two questions because we have 10 minutes. So Salvador, please.
Yeah, the last questions are, yes?
Sorry, yes.
No, it's just say, Paula, I'm now on 1%.
Oh, okay.
So like a puff of smoke, I'm going into there. I'll say goodbye before I disappear. It was a pleasure. I'm just speaking for myself. I've really enjoyed it. I've been making notes all the way through, so thank you. I'll stay until I disappear. You'll just see me disappearing someday.
Thank you, Dr. Geoffrey. Okay, so the last two questions are, what can we do to make sure the voices of the most vulnerable to climate change are heard without exploiting their vulnerability to meet a climate agenda? And the last question is, do you think that society needs to experience several pandemics to change the way that we consume goods?
Who wants to answer that?
Okay, I can talk, I think, vulnerable. And this is because I've been working with different communities, and sometimes it's is this idea that you can actually get collaborative processes just by sitting them in the same table and you will have it. And something that it is usually not like addresses all the efforts, resources, and the spent to be able to participate in those tables. And I think something that illustrates this clearly is what is the actual and direct. I think I have an echo somewhere. What is the actual direct access that communities have to climate finance? That's a major, like a key example, because most of the times you get intermediaries, you get large NGOs speaking for them, and then you actually ask, like, what exactly is the NGO agenda and what exactly is the community agenda. And something that we've been in the consultant group that I work, we've been getting interviews into these key agents in this area of climate finance, at least in Mexico. And we realize that there are so many needs in capacity building to get to reduce the amount of intermediaries and to get them into the table, being able to speak and being able to put their priorities and to make them clear. And most of the time, these priorities have to be accounted through the consideration of different knowledges and values. And sometimes those things are not necessarily what is in the agenda of the financial institutions. I'm talking about GFC, for example, the Green Climate Fund, and GEF. So I will leave it like that, and I would like to get the other speakers' insights into this.
Just that the importance of the voices of the community is absolutely critical. But I want to tell you a story of, I went to doing a film in a program on climate change, and I flew into Greenland, into a place called Umanak, which is an island, but it's covered in, it's locked in sea ice for many parts of the year. And I went out on the sea ice with an Inuit hunter. The whole point was that the sea ice was melting a month earlier. And I asked them, you know, have you seen climate change? Does it mean real? And he says, yes. He says, you know, the sea ice melts a month earlier than normal. And, you know, you know, that's my reality. And I said, oh, is that terrible? And he said, no, it's brilliant. It's fantastic, he says, because in the winter, my food is cutting a hole in the ice, lying there with a gun, waiting for the seal to shoot the seal. When the sea ice melts, I get on my fishing boat and I go out and I catch lots of fish. And if you then extrapolate that to the island, there were winners and losers. So the cruise ships were now coming in for a month earlier. People could do things in their houses, but absolutely there were massive cultural change happening. And even at a national level, Greenland at that time was talking about getting rich on these mining reserves and oil and gas reserves that were coming up. So the story is of winners and losers. And I think you take that all the way down to communities. On average, net, I think most communities will be worse off. But we need to start having that discussion and not assuming that it's a binary and having a kind of cartoon version of what it is. So we need to be absolutely, genuinely, authentically talking to communities so we can hear their stories to find out where the winners are, where the losers are, and how we address that in order for that point of social justice that we talked about earlier.
Yes, I just want to add some comments to what has been said. I think there's a huge opportunity in knowledge that's called transdisciplinary knowledge, because people have a very good empirical, practical knowledge, and we don't know it, and they don't know our science. So we can construct new concepts, new ideas, new actions if we try to merge those knowledge. And we have lived several examples. They give us the question and we write papers and whatever, but we didn't knew that they. So what I'm saying, we have to hear, I'm sorry, hear first their voice. What do they think, as Jan told us? Because I'm sure you didn't know that you will have that answer, and I have found several answers with women that produce vegetables and coffee producers, maize producers, that really opened my eyes. It's the same numbers, but when they describe the rain pattern, and was so they need a small drought here for coffee production or whatever. So I think if we hear the voice of the people, we can have very interesting transdisciplinary research. That would be my point.
Well, thank you very much for your answers. We are 5 minutes to finish this panel, and I think it has been amazing interaction. And also, I remember when we said we will have 2 hours, like 2 hours, and now we are here. So it means that we enjoyed it. I think we explored more than we said that we were going to. So I hope also that the audience enjoyed as I did, and I hope you did as well as a panelist. So I would like to have like a final, I don't know, thought or something that you would like to express to our audience just to close this panel. And I really thank you. And before we say goodbye, I would like to thank to the organizers, also to Salvador and my students, Juan, Alanis, Ulises, that were behind backstage helping a lot before. Thank you very much. And please, I don't know, Abril, if you want to start, and let's carry on.
I had like this phrase that I was thinking about, and I don't know if you could agree on, but I was thinking about when we're talking about transformations towards sustainability, and I was trying to think about it from my practice. I was thinking transformation towards sustainability should not be incommensurable between communities of practice. So that's like the key issue that I want to address, is that we're not talking about from a sectoral perspective. We need to really think on how it works from a cross-cutting collaboration. That means vertical and horizontal collaboration. And that means transdisciplinary processes, and that means also engaging with sectors that may be contested by our own perspectives and points of view. That would be it.
Thank you very much. Cecilia, please.
When I was thinking of this discussion today, I remember, well, several publications. One is the Adaptation Policy Framework. I was involved in the chapter of how to get stakeholders involved. And there's the ladder of knowledge. At the last step, the first step is you go to a community, you get your information and publish your paper. And that's good. And then the other step is, one of other steps is you get money from an organization, you go do your project, the money ended, the project ended. So, and the last step of the ladder is where is self-mobilization and even catalyzing change. And I have only seen one example of women in Mexico that produce vegetables, but they did their training training book to share with other women. So we are no longer there, but women open the book and say, and teach other women to do the examples of their agricultural proposal. So I think that's interesting. And the other thing I remember was, it's a very old book, but it's called, from Thomas Kuhn, the structure of scientific revolutions. I think climate change, pandemic, and these global problems need a revolution, the way we think science. Consider that as an institution, as a learning process, teaching, and research. I think we should start thinking that the science we have is not enough.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. And please, yeah.
Well, both those points, like what they said, is one of the things I was going to say. 2 points, I guess. One is we should be thinking and concentrating on changing the areas that we can change that are closest to us. So there's big global politics and global business, but actually we can change those places that we're closest to will be, ourselves, our homes. But actually, the point that I really want to make, it's that point I made earlier, is as an academic, is the universities. I think we have to change the universities. The universities are not fit for purpose for the challenge that we've got, and they're not changing fast enough. And that relates to the second point, which Cecilia, well, actually both Cecilia and April touched on, about transdisciplinary and about scientists and not just scientists, academics, becoming part of the transformative change, to be catalysts and activists for change. Very uncomfortable territory for many academics. They don't want to be doing it. They want to be writing their academic papers and getting the research grants. But for those that have looked at those climate models and understand them, it is a pretty terrifying prospect. And I don't think science and academia can just sit back and do that. So I think it's about change, transformative change, and it needs to start close to home.
Well, thank you very much for your participation, for your experience, to share your experiences with us. And also, well, I don't want to keep you longer. We have lots of audience now, 29 people connected, and they were buried during the 2 hours, but we have more events and the schedule is very tight, but we are just in time. And I really appreciate your time. I hope you enjoyed it as I did. And Cecilia, Abril, and thank you very much. And also Jeffrey, that he just left us. No, but thank you very much for everything.
And thank you, Paula, for the great sharing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great initiative. Thank you.
Yes, see you around. Please
I will
visit
write you,
next
Abril.
time.
Goodbye. Thank you, Jan. Very good ideas. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Lovely to share the screen with you. And thanks, Salvador.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a honor. Thank you very much, you all.